Have you ever seen a jump? A rift in space-time is not a pretty thing. It looks like a curtain rent with an old blade. Fragments drift around the edges, for a dull knife tears rather than cuts. Its center is obsidian, devouring all light like gazing past the event horizon of a black hole. The mind doesn't know how to react to a complete lack of visual input and insists something is wrong. It tries to correct your eyes, throwing up dark purple and strange flashes of lightning. Don't look too hard, it's safer to stare unblinking into a star. The destroyer materializes, section by section, like it's being rendered by a computer grinding through a stress test. Completed sections of hull steam slightly, or maybe it's smoke. Tendrils of purple reach like groping fingers, curling around the engines and snagging mass driver barrels like the gas inside a plasma globe. The rift begins to collapse in on itself, but tendrils still reach for the ship, as if hyperspace is unwilling to give up that which once traveled the higher planes. Then, suddenly, as a surgeon stitches a wound, the tear in reality closes, and the grasping tendrils dissipate into nothingness. I can picture the destroyer looming in the void, crouched like a hunting predator. Almost imperceptibly, a single barrel from the gun houses pitches upward a fraction of a degree. Then a flash lights the void, instantaneously countered by stabilization thrusters. This memory is seared into my retinas, as is the afterimage of the distant flare as 1,500 kilograms of Teran-manufactured, armor-piercing, depleted uranium slug meets the hull of a Shrike cruiser at 2,300 meters per second. One half the mass times velocity squared. Energy cannons just don't do it like a railgun. I am Charlotte. It is not the name that was given to me, but the one I earned, and the one I use. I was born on the largest moon of the Varian cluster. They're garden worlds. High oxygen and low gravity. Few predators through their evolutionary history. Fewer natural resources. Unfortunate position on the outskirts of a distant system. Subsistence farming and small game hunting mostly. My species' first contact war wasn't even a war. Just a slaving crew that rounded up a couple hundred Vari for manual labor on another world halfway across the void. It's been a very long time since then. The Corps passed some regulations and a bunch of laws against slavery. Set up some starports on the surface and a freight harbor in geostationary orbit. The cluster has assimilated. We're part of the greater collective now. Same rights as every other species throughout the galaxies. Bunch of the ultra-wealthy even set up their vacation resorts here. Except that this far out from the core worlds, none of those laws and regulations and tech mean much. 10 generations and FTL capabilities later, and the only real change is that when my father sold me and my sisters into the hold of the cargo hauler, the manifest had to say we each got 24 credits per shift. I didn't get to see my first jump. Huddled in the lightless hold, breathing the stale atmo, the passage through the relay station was just a violent shudder of the hauler's frame, and a numbness of my extremities that lasted scarce 20 breaths. Except that shudder was the cargo ship entering an FTL lane from a jump point 400,000 kilometers from the surface of my homeworld, and the numbness was my molecular structure exiting that same lane hundreds of light years away. The distances were incomprehensible. Still are. I'm just more used to hearing numbers like that now. That night was the first time I finally understood why creatures say the void is cold. It's not the temperature. I was overheated, crowded in that hold with the 100 or so others. It's being alone, and the sheer incomprehensible distances involved. The distance light travels in a year. Sure, the definition of a year varies depending on the world you're on. Not that it really matters. Light is fast. You're just alone out there. When that hold was finally opened, the light of the unfamiliar star was blinding. I couldn't believe I'd spent the first part of my life looking at the sky with yearning. Because I got to see that sky now, filtered through a haze of radiation shielding and synthoglass reflections, and it brought nothing but fear. The Shrike bulls herded us out of the hold with roars and shoves. My sisters were dragged one way, and I another. They fought, I didn't. What could I do? Shrike are a combat species. They're naturally armed and armored, have a variety of senses beyond the standard and uncommon shock resistance. Their civilization is known throughout the galaxies as a formidable military threat, and their mercs are quickly snapped up by private contractors or wealthy individuals in need of bodyguards. They have a reputation, backed by results. They're the reason creatures get jittery when they hear high-grav predator. I didn't know what happened to my sisters. Someone told me they ended up on a shuttle toward Kalestis Hub. If that's true, I knew they'd probably live out their days as companions in the entertainment district. I was shoved toward the mining crews. The only difference was the quotas. Just a tick mark on a data pad and a careless number tattooed on my arm over some harsh sterilizer. Not even worth a tracking chip. Once all the viri were processed, the slavers herded us back to the cargo bays. There were more of us then. Species I recognized and species I didn't. Most I didn't. The backwater world I was born on didn't see many tourists. All my knowledge of the greater galaxies had been collected overhearing freighter crews loading their shipments of pelts off my homeworld. I remember the smell more than anything. Whatever the freighter had transported before us had left a stench that turned the Atmo to soup, with ventilation filters that probably hadn't been changed in the lifetime of the ship. I lingered there, panting in the filth and humidity, packed with enough other creatures that I was forced to sleep standing. There was no way to track time in the darkness and fetter. But I did know that there was no juddering of the hull that marked the passage through a relay station. Sublight speeds. Keeping us outside of the hyperlanes to ensure we stayed remote from anyone curious enough to examine a cattle freighter. Then we began to accelerate. The rumble of the drive engines under my feet vibrated the teeth in my jaw. Bones compressed, tendons strained, and I would have crumpled to the deck if the press of bodies had not held me standing. Moans echoed through the hold as lungs were crushed and circulatory systems labored to keep brains conscious. It was a nightmare beyond anything I had imagined. A nightmare that lasted a lifetime. And when the nightmare ended, only a few moments of relief before deceleration, just as harsh to the mass of soft garden world species. I endured it better than most. I mentioned that I had spent my childhood gazing at the stars. When I was very young, one of the freighter captains told me that Very made good void travelers. He didn't give me any reasons why. Probably just being friendly to some wide-eyed child that came to look at his ship, but I thought perhaps that this was one of them. Until I lost consciousness and woke gasping. I'd have traded never seeing the stars again to be back on my homeworld with my sisters, toiling the earth to have enough food for the winter, and watching distant freighters jump through the relay station through the cracked lens of a scrounged telescope. Back before I knew who my father really was. But no creature gets to choose, I suppose, just react. When the hydraulic ramps opened, grinding on ancient hinges, we spilled from the hold onto the deck, dragging in lungfuls of filtered Atmo and scrounging across the steel for the rations our captors had thrown at us. The Varian behind me fell when I moved. He'd died during the journey and I hadn't known. He told me his name, I'm sure, but I can't remember it. The Shrike waded through us, their hulking forms half as tall again as I am. One was coming toward me, talons pushed out and horns lowered. A creature of a species I didn't know froze in place, spines along its head and backbone limp with fear, legs with backwards knees shaking. The Shrike didn't pause, just locked his talons out and drove them up under the creature's ribs. It died, choking with punctured lungs. We all shrunk back as the slaver laughed and shouted something in a language I didn't understand. The moon was remote. A long, slow orbit that lengthened the years into lifetimes. A distant star that prolonged a permanent twilight on the tidal-locked surface. The stars nothing but faded blurs through the shimmer of radiation shielding. On the surface, the rock and ice were burrowed with mine shafts, dug and drilled and detonated into the surface to draw forth the trace metals contained within the core, inhabited by slaves that were husks of their former selves. Starved, beaten, and exhausted by slavers who knew that on the edge of the black, it was cheaper to just find another remote settlement where no reports of missing creatures would make it to someone who cared, or could do anything about it. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I went down those mine shafts, I would not return. My species did not have the hardiness. Fleeing across a surface that lacked Atmo was a joke. Fighting back against an elite combat species was a funnier one. My opportunity came during the entry shot injections, cocktails of antibiotics, antivirals, and vaccines to prevent the spread of diseases between worlds. I could see the front of the lines, where they were separating the creatures into their new professions. Heavily muscled Gwijek and multi-limbed Klissa, species far more suited to labor than my form, fragile in comparison. I'm a pilot! I forced the comment through my burned throat and cracked lips. The Shrike paused, tilting his horned head. I have pilot experience! Pilot? The word was a growl. Why do you think a female Varian would be taken to work the mines? The Shrike jerked its head in agreement. What craft? I cast back to my childhood, to the freighters launching and docking from my homeworld. N12S. The massive Shrike seized my arm and pushed me easily into another line, a line far smaller than the others. Implanter! My co-pilot was called Kel. He saved my life that first time in the O9 or mule. I think he saw how lost I was, how much pain I was in from the nervo thread woven into the base of my skull to interface the ship's computers with my manual movements. Felt like fire across my fingertips until I healed. Kel was a good teacher and a quick one. He felt some kinship with another Veri, I think. It was also in his interest that I learn, because his punishment would be just as severe as my own if we failed to complete our directives. He'd been here since the start, long since beaten down into nothing but a mule pilot. No family, no homeworld, no goals, no likes, no dislikes, no dreams. It terrified me. I didn't have a homeworld either, but the desire to survive is hardwired. And he didn't have it, so I piloted ore mules. Nervo thread is Shriek tech. Instead of sitting behind the flight controls of whatever craft you want to fly, you are the flight controls. This tech wasn't widespread across the galaxies. Most species can't survive the implant procedures. I barely did, and I have lingering side effects to this day. Even fewer species have the unique characteristics that allow their brains to talk to the computers. The military version of Shrieky Neuro Network Interface plugs gunners and pilots directly into the ship, made the Shrike Navy a predominant force in any engagement against species that couldn't do the same, hindered by flesh or silicone. Thoughts are faster than actions. Feel like. Ore mules are dumb, oafish craft. Getting plugged into one of them feels like slogging through a bog. Thoughts dragged down by sluggish thrusters and cumbersome acceleration. Slave to an O9 is mind-numbing. It's a prison that's built around your thoughts, not your body. I could feel myself becoming like Kel, content to be a slave, just a biological navigation computer. Some tried escape. Another couple of pilots tried ramming their fully loaded mule into the shuttle depot. One of the pilots survived, and the Shrike staked him out over the portal to a shaft we called Vilevale. They worked on him for 6 shifts. It was impossible to track time in the perpetual twilight of that distant star. No days or night on the tidal-locked surface. Only the slight variations in the timing of the ore shipments, depending on the hardness of the rock and durability of the drill heads, plugged into the ship computers, controlling thrust by hand signals. Sleep just as brain-dead as my wakefulness. Still better than those souls down in the pits. I think it was 3 rotations in my homeworld's time when I noticed the change. I can't describe what it was exactly. Maybe uncertainty? Like a stutter step when the expected starting bang of a race delays just a fraction too long. Overseers muttering together at their stations. Hasher punishments for every infraction. The products of the mine collecting in depots and warehouses instead of being transported to wherever they were supposed to go. The slightest of whispers that everything was not under control. Everyone began to notice it. No one knew why. A mass escape attempt was made. Creatures fearing the mine's depletion and its assets' liquidation. 17 were taken alive. 17 died unable to continue their screaming at the end. The change pricked the stupor of my nervo thread deadened mind. It made me wake up, just enough to notice that nothing was being shipped out. Whoever was running this mine wasn't there anymore. The Shriek were isolated, alone, stranded. Not like they could petition the Corps for answers. The shuttles that left didn't return from the void. Comms went unanswered. The ever-dwindling number of Shrike grew ever harsher. I hadn't thought our condition could get worse. Then a Shriek cruiser appeared out of the void, decelerating hard from its sublight journey. That's when I saw my first jump. I mean a jump. Everyone's seen a ship pass through a relay station. Most can't explain the exact physics to you, but jump points are an understood fact, as are the relay stations that shepherd ships through the light years to safety on the other side. This ship I watched ... it jumped. No jump points on either side of an FTL lane. It jumped to our remote location on the edge of the black, into a patch of void where it should not have been possible for a ship to materialize. Seems like there should be another term. Something new. No, I believe the old way should be called something else. This is what our ancestors first imagined when they looked up at the stars and yearned to travel to them. The ship was primitive, inelegant. No streamlined wings or prismatic synthoglyphs bridge. Barbaric, almost. I'd never seen warships before, just lumbering freighters and ethereal pleasure yachts. This looked like the Shrike, a breed of ship constructed for war. It was a Teran dreadnought, what they call a destroyer. A warship I had just watched accelerate a kinetic slug through a Shrike cruiser halfway through its docking procedures. The fuel cell's detonation took out the hangar bay and most of the barracks next to it. Venting Atmo fed the fire in barbed gouts, which spread through the docks and guardhouses. A deliberate shot to inflict maximum damage before the flight controllers had noticed the sensor data reporting discrepancies. The destroyer's drive engines seethed with a crimson glow, and the warship accelerated toward what remained of the docks. A dropship launched from the destroyer's belly. Kel was frozen as we watched. Our mule drifted along its last trajectory. As the flashes of the distant explosions faded into the dull orange of sustained fire, I noticed movement on my periphery. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "We need to dock while we still can!" Kel looked at me with blank eyes, a wave of his hand adjusting the mule's course with controlled bursts of the maneuvering thrusters. "That's not our directive." I felt something flare through my apathy, the desire to survive, hardwired into me, moments before I had thought the Shrika cruiser the most dangerous ship in my sector of void. Now I watched its crippled hull drifting from the ruined docks toward the nearest gravity well, spinning on an irregular axis. It broke apart on the fault line from the slug's impact, centrifugal force slinging the rear of the craft toward the hangar's support structures, where it collided in a storm of flame as the engines ruptured. The nose and midship fell toward the moon's surface, venting Atmo increasing the rate of spin. It was midway between dock and surface when another flash lit the void, burning an afterimage into my retinas. The HE round bored into the ship, detonating internally to scatter fragments of cruiser into a smog of slagged alloy and melted synthoglass. Kel jolted hard at the explosion, his flat stare focused on the destroyer. I fumbled with the harness holding me into the pilot's chair, unlocked one clasp, missed the second. Click. I lunged forward and seized the mass of fiber optics at the base of his skull. I tore them away. Kel screamed as his connection with the ship was severed. Nobody thinks twice about removing portable drive safety, but nervo-thread detach is excruciating without the right separation procedures. He hadn't been detached in void, knows how long. I knew he'd be left convulsing on the floor, shuddering with muscle spasms for some time. A gesture brought up the mule's control schemes, projected not in front of my eyes but into my brain. The fully loaded hauler accelerated sluggishly. A thruster correction sent me on course for auxiliary docks a few kilometers distant. I paused a moment, my hand frozen in the air in front of me. Then, with a savage jab, I jettisoned the oar. I cast my gaze around the surrounding void. The destroyer yawed sideways, using its drive engines to decelerate into a dead stop, only a few hundred meters from the surface, looming over the flaming structures. Most of the other ore mules had scattered like ants, but one continued toward the remains of the docks on nothing but momentum. One of the mast drivers pitched down, servos tracking the trajectory. A pause as the mule made it 1,000 meters farther. Then, another flash. The screen in my mule lost a white dot. I mimed for my mule to take a wider loop toward my destination. I was already under maximum acceleration, but I flicked my fingers at the virtual throttle anyway. I seemed a long while before I lost my sightline as I descended toward the surface. I skipped a few of the safeties during my docking, spared a glance for Kel during the detach. He lay on the floor, eyes rolled back in his head. The portal slid open. The station I entered was a ruin, ransacked by the assault. The emergency klaxons blared in rhythm with the emergency lights, beating a staccato tempo against my senses. I stumbled against a wall, unused to even walking. I heard pounding footsteps approaching down the passage and struggled to control my physical form. Wasn't able to before 6 slaves rushed past me, not sparing a look. I staggered down the passage, the light and sound pounding into my skull toward the caustic scent of burning plastic. I had a plan of sorts. One deck below were the shuttle bays. A shuttle could make the trip through the void, away from this moon, away from slavery, away from that ship. A bang echoed down the passage, far away and faint. Distant, emphatic detonations, like the cadence of an energy rifle but far louder. The blast doors had been forced open by some enormous strength. Airtight alloy bent inward from some blow, akin to a battering ram. I climbed through the hole, slicing my back and side on the jagged edges. The white hulls of the remaining shuttles were ordered in neat rows within the hangar, lit by the flashes of the warning lights. But I was not alone in that cold, steel room. The crimson pulse illuminated a creature from the destroyer. A creature crouching over the mutilated body of a dead Shrike bull. The creature was bipedal, compact, durable. Ballistic armor bruised with the carbon buildup of old energy weapon burns and new scores from Shriek talons. Exoskeleton that reinforced its organic bones with durasteel rods along its limbs. electroreactive polymers that articulated the synthetic limbs as naturally as the biological ones when it stood. Void dark helmet that angled toward me in a basilisk stare. The broken horns of a shriek warrior stamped on its armored chest in red. The severed horns of the dead Shrike held at its side in a gauntleted hand. Behind it was a predator, some kind of carnivore that stood on four limbs, head lowered and hackles raised. The beast was almost as tall as the Teran, and twice as long. Heavy muscles rippled under its furred hide as it shifted to fix me with glinting eyes. A rumbling growl spilled from between the fangs of its long snout. I froze, trembling on atrophied limbs. The creature, the Teran, was not alone. Two more were to my right, one standing in the open, the other next to a massive tool chest. The one raised a rifle to its shoulder, the other lunged forward, and I heard the faintest whine of straining servos as the tool chest crashed onto its side, the tools scattering across the deck, creating shelter for both of them to cover me with their rifles. The chest must have been 200 kilograms. I raised my arms, the universal appeal for mercy, shivering in the cold, malnourished, dressed only in a tattered shift. The Terran spoke on inter-helmet comms. I could tell by the way its head angled. A sharp motion caused the beast to slink back. A moment's hesitation, and both rifles lowered. It stepped from the Shriek's corpse, limping. I could see the mangled leg, held together more by the exo and the armor than flesh and bone. Red blood spattered the deck, red like my own, dripping down my back and side. Just 3 steps closer. Then the soldier tapped one hand on the outside of the opposite arm. A voice spoke from the helmet, growling through low-quality speakers and stripped of all emotion by a translator. It spoke Shriek, the guttural words harsh against my eardrums. We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. They were gone, and I was alone with a Shriek corpse. I tried to go back for Kel, the arduous journey stressing my already exhausted system. But when I got there, the mule was gone, the docking bay empty. So I made the trip a third time, this time through the icy white of flame-retardant foam as the sensors tripped, falling twice and passing a mob of slaves that parted around me like a wave, going the opposite direction, away from the fire. The hangar was choked with smoke when I finally crawled through the blast doors. Coughing, I entered one of the shuttles and linked the nervo thread into the ports at the top of my spine. The ship threw up complaints from the Atmo scrubbers about the pollution and warnings about launch sequences. But with a twitch of my chin, I dismissed them. If piloting an ore mule is like slogging through a swamp, a shuttle is like a draft horse. Slow and methodical, dependable, constructed for reliability. Nervo thread makes piloting much more intuitive, which is fortunate because I wouldn't have been able to fly it otherwise. A shuttle is a far cry from a mule, and the manual controls would have remained undecipherable. More shuttles detached from launch pads around the station. Even some mules made a go of it, all keeping a wide berth around the destroyer's void space. Not enough, barely any, but some. None more came from my hangar as it began to burn. And then the destroyer was not. Vanishing into hyperspace with a bloom of obsidian and writhing purple, I filtered through previous trajectories in the navigation computer and selected one that matched where I'd seen Shrieky ships arrive during my captivity. I kept the acceleration set at a manageable level those first few hours. About 2 things I was in total system shock. 1. That warship had jumped. I had witnessed the single greatest technological advancement in intergalactic history. No particular arrangement of physics, old as the galaxies themselves, that formed a jump point, where it was exclusively possible to open a wormhole. No relay station constructed around that jump point, and the connected jump point to ensure the hyperlane was transversed safely. This ship had jumped. The closest to omnipresence our 3 dimensions will ever be. 2. Those creatures had fired lethal weapons within a pressurized station, a violation of a dozen intergalactic treaties and commensurate to an immediate declaration of war. Miss a shot and cause explosive decompression, or the Atmo pumps to fail. Even I could name a dozen tragedies that killed everyone on board without the use of projectile weapons. I slept. When I awoke, I raided foodstuffs from some storage lockers, scarfing them as quickly as I could swallow. The first time I'd eaten anything other than protein blocks and vitamin pills since my homeworld. Then, I pushed the virtual throttle forward, increasing the acceleration to 4 or 5 times my homeworld's gravity. All I thought I could withstand for the duration. It was built by the Shrike, and I barely strained the drive engines on the sublight journey. My memories of the next 2 rotations are faded, corrupted like a damaged data drive. I bartered the Shrike shuttle for an unsanctioned trip through a relay station to Calestis Hub. It was a wretched hive of scum and villainy, a hyperlane hub that bottlenecked passage to 100,000 square light-years of edge of the black void space. Lawless, unsettled territory inhabited by deep-range mining crews, explorers more insane than sane, and creatures that had a vested interest in remaining hidden from the core worlds. I remember mostly being hungry as I trawled the drug dens and gambling clubs, searching through the brothels and fighting pits for my sisters, ducking away from peacekeeper garrisons more corrupt than the pirates and smugglers making their lives in the baronies, millions of kilometers from the settled worlds. I lied, cheated, and fought my way through the underbelly, arriving at the same answer every time. Very don't survive here. I became hard, like callus over raw skin. I learned how to use weapons, how to evade, how to forge documentation and identification. I became numb, brain dead, apathetic like Kel had been, driven on instinct instead of thought, a biological computer processing input and output without emotion. Until that last night on the hub, I fired a bolt bouncer through the torso of a Desreti slaver when she laid a hand on me. Purely emotion. Fear so intense I could taste it in the filtered atmo. The crime was a death sentence. I ran, burning the last of my credits to buy docs and IDs to get me through another half-dozen relay stations to the outer rim, selling my body to eat and worse. This life had overtuned my senses like raw nerves. So I noticed the whispers quickly. Almost as soon as the stories drifted through from deep mining crews, long-range exploration probes, and pirate cartels. Stories of a secret war. A war waged on the edge of the black, where the dwindling echoes of torpedo and energy cannon were not permitted to stray into the outer rim until it was already finished. And when this war was finished, a civilization was gone. Not driven back. Not defeated. Gone. Snuffed like a sputtering candle in the infinite darkness of the void. The outskirts of the settled galaxies heard the stories and noticed the turbulence under the calm surface. Deep mining crews vanishing without a distress beacon. Smugglers found drifting with untouched cargo. Missing trajectory reports and communication terminals rerouting comm signals because a relay station had gone dark. Pirate boardings that left valuable cargo untouched and the data drive scrubbed. Warn them? Who would believe me? I hadn't even heard the word Teran at that point. No one had. Just stories from creatures too long in the deep. Until they weren't just stories, and they were reports of monsters awoken from beyond the black. Monsters that had eradicated Shriek civilization, and now hunted the remnant wherever they fled. Monsters that called themselves Teran. The core didn't notice. There was trade, politics, science, art, ultra-rich corpo barons and distant oligarchies self-consumed with their own lives, unable to look past their homeworlds to the outer rim, to notice the silence like drifting fog, to notice relentless hunters tracking across the stars any Shriek who had somehow slipped from what had been awoken at the edge of the black, to notice the insidious dead space creeping ever closer toward the settled worlds. So I played the last card in my hand. Nervothread cyberware bartered for a mess of untraceable credits dumped into my virtual wallet. Getaway pilot for a cartel hit using a surplus Shriek gunship. My link-ups were barely compatible with military tech, but it was enough to only take a few practice runs before I could cover the rest with manual controls. The Nervothread gave me enough of an edge to be worth the money. When it was done, I told them to scrap the ship. Those of us on the outer rim, in the outskirts, in the baronies, we knew what was coming. The hunters were merciless, inexorable as the maw of a black hole. Relentless, living weapons that had but one directive. A directive to destroy Shriek by any means necessary, indifferent to collateral damage of both metal and flesh. There was another war coming, because it was only a matter of time before a Teran hunter inflicted that collateral damage upon something that belonged to the core. The cartel payout was more than enough to get my own ship. I didn't even consider something Shriek, despite my augmentations. I knew that would be akin to painting targeting lasers on my chest. An Outrider-class sloop retrofitted with a jump drive suited my needs, and I slingshot my way through the relay stations unnoticed beyond routine queries. I exited that final relay station. 400,000 kilometers in the distant void, my homeworld shone blue and green. My pistol was aimed on an outstretched arm when he opened the door to the building I used to call home. It was stronger now, muscled, tattooed, scarred with the story of these past 9 years in my homeworld's time. None now remembered me, or would recognize me if they did. I had lived beyond this world, and I now saw my species for what we were. Weak, subservient, living in wretched hovels on the scraps of tech that fell broken, from the relay station to our surface. It disgusted me. The result of our assimilation into the greater collective of sapient species. The same as all species left to rot on the outskirts, isolated from convenient jump points. Someone once called pistols the great equalizer, and we still used bows. My fingers tensed on the trigger, squeezing the mechanism ever closer to that fatal click. But the Varian who opened the door was not my father. He had died of sickness years ago. The revelation drained my form of rage and fear and grief. Purposeless. Empty. Just a biological computer processing input and output. Watching a powerful Desretti slaving consortium fill the vacuum left by the Shriek. Armed mercenaries herding my species into slave ships, passing through the same relay station as the pleasure yachts traveling to and from the personal resorts of the ultra-wealthy. Revulsion so strong I could taste it. They didn't care or didn't know. Or they took a cut of the action. Then that video exploded across the networks. A Shriek civilian transport ship that bumped into a mining probe on the outer rim. Lawless, contested void space claimed by one syndicate and two lunar confederacies. An unarmed, unshielded cruise liner with heat-burned drive engines and spent fuel cells, scraps of expired rations, and a hole in the side that vented 3 decks. Punched there at close range by a mass driver. No energy weapons. Too civilized. The interior of that transport was ripped apart with kinetics. And the Shriek aboard weren't just slaughtered. They were hurt. Tortured. Civilians, females, young. The males were crucified. The Corps finally took notice. Then the second video feed, taken by a medical crew accelerating to the assistance of an unencrypted distress beacon broadcast by a crippled Shriek frigate. They got there just before the Teran destroyer dropped from hyperspace with a burst of purple-edged obsidian. It was a dark ship, a ship that looked like Warfelt, a ship that awoke suppressed emotions from my time of slavery aboard that distant moon. He rounds bored through the frigate's weakened hull and transformed the ship to molten slag. One of the escort cruisers for the medical convoy managed a plasma cannon shot. It dissipated in blue ripples across the dreadnought's shields. Thrusters fired, and the dreadnought turned with malevolent intent to bring its mass drivers to bear on the cruiser. Then harpoons lashed out like a multitude of snakes. That's when the feed cut, but I heard the Teran shock troopers ripped the medical ships apart, searching for more Shrika, the collateral damage we'd been waiting for in the outer rim. Then eyewitness accounts of the jump away. The catastrophic revelation that a theoretical problem had been solved incited mass panic. A species that could jump. Teran ships did not depend upon FTL jump points or relay stations. They jumped. From anywhere to anywhere. Teran ships could jump. Every strategic position among the stars was rendered invalid. FTL lane fortifications, orbital turret emplacements, battleship dry docks, munitions depots, all superfluous against an enemy that could jump. The entirety of modern ship-to-ship and ship-to-surface combat doctrine meaningless. Mass panic, understatement, mass hysteria. I had ensured my Outrider was equipped with an enhanced sensor package, so I remained as well informed as everyone else outside of the various military commands. It wasn't much, really. It's only now that I can really fill in the blanks. Terra's reach was long indeed, fingers scrabbling through the stars for any creature that had escaped the First Contact War. Except those scrabbling fingers had caused collateral damage, and a chain reaction of treaties and alliances and mutual defense agreements quickly forced the galaxies into united conflict. The Corps lashed out in panic, striking advanced stations and carrier docks with the full strength of its available fleets, erasing the presence of Teran from within the settled worlds, driving them again to their homeworld on the edge of the black. But when the Teran hit back, their armored hulls and mass drivers hit hard. Military doctrine states that at the onset of any conflict, the first priority is to secure the FTL lanes in order to establish operating bases. But there are no battle lines against a species that can jump. No defensible positions. The war was everywhere and nowhere. The war was wherever Terra deigned it to be. Core, the outskirts, outer rim, the baronies. The battlefront was the entirety of the void. The united galaxies against one system. The war was a war of unnatural terror. It was a war fought entirely on Terra's terms. Jump and a Teran destroyer dropped from hyperspace with the same obsidian purple that announced the warping of reality. Jump. And the wreckage and ruin of a fleeing Shrike racing yacht or a military fueling station or a cartel gunship were drifting slag and cerulean flares of burning atmo. Jump. Nothing but dead space where the destroyer had been. Jump. Torpedoes burning hard for an unsuspecting troop transport. Jump. Federation factory obliterated by orbital bombardment. Jump. 1,500 kilogram depleted uranium slug accelerated through the hull of a battleship. Jump. Torpedo. Jump. Slug. Jump. He round. Jump. 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 A military convoy passing through the space between FTL lanes would be ambushed by the combined firepower of an entire Terran destroyer command dropped out of hyperspace at close range. Terran carriers would skip past orbital defenses, downshifting to release their payloads of heavy bombers into the stratosphere, to turn the sky over planetary dry docks dark with saturation bombing. Forces deployed against Terran navies were baited into a cat and mouse game. Jump after jump, taunting, just out of range. Until frustration and impatience got the better of inexperienced recruits, and they strayed too far from the safety of the fold, where the predators circled invisibly, hidden behind layer after layer of hyperspace, waiting for the slaughter. The consolidated might of the core was worthless. Like I said, blanks filled in after the fact. Out in the cluster, reports were cycles out of date and garbled by second or third-hand accounts. Life, such as it was, remained life. Sure, many of the opulent citizens abandoned their private homes to return to what they thought was the safety of the core. And there was a brief period of unrest when the Dayreti Consortium made a power play and hijacked the relay station to effectively control the entire void space. I watched a mansion pillaged and burned as they enslaved one of the wealthy families that remained. Watched through magnified lenses as those spoiled, soft magnates were thrown into a cargo hauler. Life remained life. A report came through the relay station that a great battle had been fought somewhere called the Sol system, that the United Confederation Navy had for the first time entered Terran void space and decisively defeated a Terran fleet. A turning point in the war. But a second report followed days later. It detailed a retaliatory jump into the very center of the core, where behemoths with bellies of incendiary bombs had struck residential megablocks. Napalm on a high-oxy world. It was then that the United Galaxies were subjected to what would come to be called the Teran doctrine, a concept of total war realized by a species with singular, fanatical purpose. War at the hand of sleeping monsters awoken by the shriek during the First Contact War, awoken like an elder god's vengeance. Primal savagery and inexorable fury, blood and iron, durasteel and depleted uranium. Not since the Shrike Crusades had carnage been industrialized on this awesome scale. The United Galaxies were embroiled in a total war against a species that could jump. I lingered, hidden and unbothered, squatting in an abandoned lodge some Atlian politician wasn't using. Let the galaxies burn. These Teran, these monsters from the edge of the black, retribution for the sins of the uncaring core. The night I heard of the contagion bombs, I celebrated with the politicians' alcohol reserves. I was awoken by the alarms from my ship's sensor package. I remember the crushing feeling as I realized the alcohol poisoning hadn't killed me. I wrenched my pounding head to the side, where my pistol lay, close at hand. But the desire to survive is hardwired. I crawled to the kitchen for water. When I came to again, the alarms were just as insistent. I dragged myself to my feet and staggered to the bridge of my sloop. The HUD was too bright, and I blinked eyes that felt filled with sand. It took me some time to make sense of the data. I didn't believe it at first, so I rolled back the records. The relay station hung in the void, surrounding the solitary jump point in this patch of void. The only link to the outside worlds if you and your grandchildren didn't want to die of old age at sublight speeds. For the second time, I saw an incoming jump, albeit on my ship's screens. The bloom of obsidian threw up warnings across every sensor I had. Computers don't know how to deal with zero data, and several systems rebooted to clear error codes. The ones that stayed online informed me that matter had materialized with 11 cubic centimeters of durasteel in three-dimensional space currently occupied by relay station alloy. The resulting explosion was comparable to a torpedo strike. The delicate structures of the relay station shattered into mirror-like shards of rare metals. The Terran destroyer was shoved violently in the opposite direction, toward my world's surface at a delta V my species wouldn't survive. My sensors told me the destroyer attempted to correct course, thrusters firing to counteract the spin, but the drive engines were dead. Not enough to pull it out of its fall toward the surface of my world. Atmospheric friction streaked fire across the sky. I seized my pistol and began to run. The destroyer had carved a ravine into the surface. The durasteel armor was slagged by energy cannons and ruptured by missile impacts. honeycomb-like internals sealed to prevent decompression from the breaches in the hull. One of the gun houses had mass driver barrels bent like broken fingers, belching oily smoke. I heard the screech of metal on metal, a dead drive engine thrust vectoring, malfunctioning flight controls like the death rattle of a dying animal. A Teran dropped from the nose of the craft through an unsealed blast door through the rent in the hull, plating from energy cannon impact, melting the shoulder of his pressure suit against the superheated metal as he passed. He landed easily, exoskeleton absorbing the impact, rifle held low ready, helmet turning to scan the surrounding area. I could see a vehicle approaching. An open-topped, wheeled transport filled with Desready mercs. The advance force, undoubtedly followed by more. I wondered what the bounty was on captured Teran. 2 more Teran dropped from the punctured hull, armored and armed as the first. The Desready established a sightline, slowing their vehicle as they adjusted course between a boulder and a copse of vegetation. A squad in the back bristling with energy weapons. One stood, some kind of rocket-propelled grenade on his shoulder, and the destroyer awoke. 120,000 kilograms of turreted mass driver pitched downward, massive servo motors adjusting to their firing solutions. A flash whited out my vision. Half a moment later, the sound and shockwave punched into my chest. The Desready and their vehicle effectively vaporized. Isn't there some saying about dying animals being the most dangerous? I watched for another moment, then blinked as I decided. Purposeless no more. I stepped into the open, pulling the energy cell from my pistol. They clacked together as they hit the grass. Next was my shirt. I felt the wind blow heat from the destroyer onto my skin. A chain gun perked up in its cradle as I stepped again. I heard the whine as the servos twitched the gun onto my position, but I kept my gaze on the Teran shock trooper. The one in the exo, with the broken horns of a shriek warrior stamped on its chest in red. I turned in a complete circle, outstretching my arms. Universal symbol for, I'm not carrying a weapon. I could see the Desready advancing. In the distance, converted cattle carriers packed with mercs and outmoded tanks waiting for the range of their energy cannons. Some sort of surface-to-surface anti-armor weapon arced toward the Teran ship. The destroyer answered with CIWs that threw ribbons of tracers into the sky, streams the dull red of Durasteel impacted by energy cannons. I opened my mouth, shriek words spat between my teeth. We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. The Teran brought his rifle up. He answered in the growling, guttural language of the shriek, amplified by his helmet's speakers. Get on the ground! Get on the ground now! I knelt. Get down or you will be fired upon! Arms outstretched! I fell forward, feeling the grass against my chest, cool after the heat of the destroyer and the star's daylight. Another burst of CIWs tore through the atmo, followed by the thudding of a chain gun. I suppressed the twisted pleasure as I heard Desready screams, faint in the distance. Stay down! Who are you? The Teran shock trooper was almost to me, followed by 2 more like him. Combat-worn ballistic armor, plasma burns in sharp relief against the matte of the paint. One had the faded remains of a skull stenciled on its helmet in white. I'd seen plenty of powered exoskeletons before, but these were somehow different. These were brutal. Bare machine without polymer guards to smooth the jagged edges or rounded streamlining on the rugged structure. These didn't pretend to have been built for anything but combat, stripped down to nothing but cold alloy. I wondered if I had made the wrong choice, as I turned my head to stare into the acrid-smelling barrel of the kinetic rifle. And as the second soldier felt along my legs for weapons, I found that I didn't care. Who are you? Another tearing sound as CW's tracers sliced across the sky. Then the thunderbolt of a mass driver, the force of the gun sending dirt and grass into the air on the shockwave. I blinked debris out of my eyes. My gaze seemed to be locked onto the broken horns of a Shrike warrior, stamped onto the Teran's chest in faded red. You destroyed the Shriek? Who are you? The voice was loud, stripped of inflection through low-quality speakers. One of the Teran knelt, his knee pinning me to the ground. An ally! I hissed. I felt his hand against my shoulder blade. A pause, a long pause, broken by another brrrt of CWs. A Teran boot shoved me onto my back. 2 kinetics aimed at my chest. The third soldier swept his rifle in wide arcs. Overwatch. How did you get Neuralink? The Teran shouted, voice deadened by the helmet's speaker system. When I was a slave of the Shrieky before your kind killed them! I screamed back, my voice sounding small and high in contrast to the armored creature above me. And I have been the slave of those you now fight. I am not your enemy. The world went quiet as I waited. Fraction of an instant that felt like a year. I'm not your enemy. A heartbeat. A stream of red tracers across the sky. Another heartbeat. And I found that I did care. I cared so much that the realization made me gasp, dragging in a lungful of dust and heat and the acrid smell of kinetics. I closed my eyes. Please don't leave me stranded without a relay. A decision was made. The Teran seized my arm and hauled me to my feet, his exo's augmented strength dragging me several meters before I found my footing. The three escorted me at a running half-crouch, one before and one behind. There were a half-dozen armored Terans spread across the earthen cover, formed when the destroyer slammed into the ground. They watched me, the face masks of their helmets almost translucent in the daylight. The Teran pulled me close, then lifted me toward the breached hull of the destroyer. I slapped my fingers onto the edge, pulling myself upward with the effortless assistance of the shock trooper. He jumped and hauled himself up behind me, the exoskeleton making the motion as natural as walking. The blast doors opened, and for a single moment, I thought I had stepped into hell. The atmo was choked with noise and heat, humid and thick, the scent of sweat and fear and anger. Klaxons blared, keening a steady intonation. Combat lighting that turned my skin sickly, dashed by yellow hazard lights. Shrieks and wails echoed from the durasteel depths of the dying monster. Curses and screams, orders and acknowledgement. The reverberating roar of CIWs, amplified in the enclosed passages between decks. The boom of a mass driver dimming the illumination paneling physically felt like a sucker punch to my ribs. A hollow, resounding clang as if the sky had fallen when the CIW's network was overwhelmed and a missile impacted the hull plating. I was dragged through the internals of the dying beast, through the nightmare of metal and flesh. Shoved past half-seen Terran crewmen that stared with eyes that burned through me, like targeting lasers painting an enemy hull, until we made it to the destroyer's belly, where the roar of combat was transformed to white readouts on display screens and crimson warnings pulsing on HUDs. The Teran who stood across from me was unarmored. His pressure suit was colorless in the combat lighting, script across his chest and on his shoulder, his only marking. He made a loud click somehow with his fingers, and a motion I didn't understand. In response, a rough blanket was thrown over my shoulders. I stared at him. Because armorless, he looked like me. Like the very. 2 arms, 2 legs, hair, ears, sharp nose. Only the eyes were different. Strange, ringed things that seemed to burn with internal light, but not identical. The brow was heavier, jaw thicker, shoulders and torso encased in muscle. Compact, durable. I could tell by his movements he was stronger and quicker. Like me, but evolved on a death world. Very if we were predators instead of prey. A creature almost a combat species. Fully such a species only when joined with their tech and the singular drive of their psyche. He spoke Shrieky well, with an accent better than mine. Vocal structures suited to the tongue. They tell me you were implanted while you were a slave to the Shriek. Yes. You escaped? Your kind killed them. We killed a lot of Shrieeka. His gaze was unwavering through his burning eyes. You don't fight for the UCN. They never fought for me. He said nothing, just bored his burning gaze into me. As the white and blue and green display readouts and projected HUDs were slowly, relentlessly, submerged in a sea of malfunction red, a mass driver's boom dimmed the lighting. An instant later, CIWs intensified. Another half instant, and something impacted the hull above me. The destroyer rocked, sending me reeling. The Teran only swayed, anchored by mag boots to the durasteel deck. Several HUDs refreshed crimson as a high tone wailed, drawing frantic speech in a tongue I didn't know. A Teran female, strapped into a flight chair, let a long, agonized moan drain through her clenched jaw. Amid the distant reverberation of CWs and chain cannons, she came awake, thrashing erratically. Because detach is excruciating without the proper separation procedures. This is Shriek Tech? I asked slowly, unsure at first. Flickering my eyes across the displays, across the flight chairs and Teran crewmen. Pilots and gunners plugged into computers. You stole this from the Shrike. Spoils of war, he spoke carefully, still considering me. I echoed the words I had spoken so long ago, the ones that had saved me from the mines. I'm a pilot. Can you read stellar coordinates? Yes. I felt some long-forgotten emotion rising within me. Void take me, I thought. This species will conquer the stars. I spun back toward him as another impact shook the destroyer's hull. Jump! I almost yelled. I stepped toward him. The Teran shock troopers behind me lunged forward, stopped when I halted. I held up my arm. The tattoo was faded now, after such a time, but still easily visible on my pale skin. He stood impassive before me. This is all the core has given me. No species in the stars came for me but you. Jump away and let me fight against the ones who wronged me, or if I can't fight. He made his decision, unfastening the top of his uniform to strip it back to only a thin shirt. The muscles in his forearms stood out in relief under the combat lighting. Energy weapon scarring curled down his upper arm and around his elbow. But on the inside of his forearm, faded, barely legible anymore, was a tattoo. 11 numbers in shriek script. I remember shock like plunging into glacial water. What did they want from your kind? His fist clenched, relaxed. He fastened the uniform quickly, expertly after long practice. They wanted what we could not give. The guns were silent now, I realized. Now, girl, he continued, his speech hard but not unkind. I really hope you weren't lying. I stared a question at this Teran, one of a kind that had risen against their masters and hunted them to extinction among the stars. Because I'm down 2 pilots. He guided me toward a flight chair. There was a Teran in it. He undid the harness and dragged the female onto the deck. Her body was limp, eyes dull and sightless. Because this used to be my navigator, and because my destroyer has 1 jump left in her capacitors. He gestured toward the chair. And because in 4 minutes those creatures out there are going to cut through my hull. I placed 1 palm on the chair. It was cushioned, cold. Are you sure? He asked. No creature within the settled galaxies may not choose a side in this war. Why would I not fight with the freed? I whispered. His voice was sardonic, mirthless humor. Because we're losing. I lowered myself into the navigator's flight chair. That's fine, I thought. I've been losing my whole life. Have you ever seen a jump? I don't mean passing through a relay station along a hyperlane. Most can't quote the exact physics, but pre-existing jump points are an established fact among the stars. Discovered, not constructed. Networked with other jump points and shielded by constructed relay stations to ensure the FTL journey is both unquestionably safe and perfectly accurate. No, I mean a jump. The single greatest technological advancement within the settled galaxies. Dematerializing at one point in existence and materializing at another. The pinnacle of Terran technological and scientific advancement, reshaping reality itself, inconsiderate of the physical laws of both space and time. A wormhole anywhere to anywhere. The closest thing to omnipresence our 3 dimensions will ever know. They can call the old way anything else for all I care. Teran are the only species that can jump. Have you ever seen it? No, I can tell you haven't. You've only seen it with your eyes. Through fleshly organs frail and delicate as any other structure in your body. You've seen only that which is perceivable to your 3 dimensions. The obsidian rent and purple tendrils of a 3-dimensional being struggling to make sense of the higher planes. You haven't seen it through more than your eyes. You haven't seen it through 90 million worth of Neuralink input and output cyberware. You haven't seen it through radar and LiDAR. Through sensor packages designed to function where radar and LiDAR can't, to interface with biological matter, so pilots and gunners can see hostile battleships while the jump drives are still downshifting through layer after layer of hyperspace. You've never looked with corporeal eyes out of synthoglass portholes during the passage through hyperspace. I reclined in the navigator's chair, restrained against violent maneuvering, shivering against the slowly warming cushion, while the Desready consortium mercs cut through the armored hull. I wondered what the bounty was on live Teran. The other Teran in the room had protested, when their leader led me toward the chair. Surged forward with oaths and protests, clutching fingers seeking to drag me back, away from their dead female that had once been a navigator. But their leader had barked in the Teran tongue, barked like a predator warning prey back from a claimed kill. And they halted, shrank back, mutterings and murmurs quelled with a stare through his strange, ringed, burning eyes. And he turned to me again, his back toward those who followed his orders, even when unwilling. And he spoke stellar coordinates in the Shrike tongue. I looked at him for a long moment, closed my eyes as I thought, shivered once from stress and fear. It wasn't right. Didn't make sense. He wasn't telling me something. Do you trust me? I asked him. Can I? No, I answered simply. Except that you told me this warship has only 1 jump remaining in her. And if we jump where you tell me to, we will spend the rest of this war and our lives frozen in the void on the outer rim. He was thinking again, considering. Methodically calculating his way through data, his gaze unwavering through his burning eyes. I pushed him again. Your kind was awoken from near the Shriek homeworlds. Those coordinates aren't to your homeworlds, and the first strikes by the United Galaxies erased your outposts. You're just going to wait for a rescue. He nodded just once. Homeworld, he corrected. Just one, and gave me another set of coordinates. Then he drew a kinetic pistol from its holster and pressed the cold barrel into my temple. I think I may have just committed treason. Mirthless humor again. Don't. He didn't complete the thought. I lay back and he linked the destroyer interface with my nervo thread. The synthetic filaments woven into the nerves through my spinal column ignited into flame. Burned like the first day they were implanted, pain like wildfire across my fingertips, forcing my jaws open in a soundless scream. I'd been slave to O9 or mules, confined before to Shriek shuttles. I'd piloted cartel gunships off the orbit of Illurion. But now for the first time I was linked with her. A Teran dreadnought, what they call a destroyer. The pinnacle of the Teran war machine and the personification of the vengeance for their enslavement before the First Contact War. An apex predator of the void. I'd thought her dead, a shell, nothing but a husk of durasteel and sapped ion shielding. But I realize now. Even through link-ups barely compatible with the Teran tech, adapted from stolen Shriek architecture, I realized she was a slumbering behemoth, a wounded colossus, the sum of a physics equation that equaled 50 million kilograms of potential energy. And I told her where I needed her to be. She did not submit willingly. She fought. An almost incomprehensible force against my lone, fragile garden world form. Tens of millions of kilograms of durasteel hull, CIW's cradles, chain gun emplacements, torpedo batteries, missile tubes, and mass driver gun houses struggled against my will. Ion shielding flared into the visible spectrum, ripples of blue across the hull plating. Keening sirens intoned their frantic cries. Nuclear reactors buried in her belly surged power into the integrated systems of the ship. Her wounds seethed warnings across HUDs and displays. Automated defense systems challenged my decision, insisting their programming could defend indefinitely, requiring only that the gun crews supply more ordnance for their deadly task. I wrestled with her, organic flesh against synthetic construction. A single creature opposed to the culmination of an entire species' militaristic capabilities. And I told her where I needed her to be. Damaged drive engines struggled to reignite. Ruptured fuel cells burned. Gravity warped under me as the jump drives spooled up. And I told her where I needed her to be. Emergency klaxons blared their warnings. She groaned and wailed with the strain of her systems of biological matter and manufactured alloys. She fought, seeking to drive me from herself, to purge me from her processors, to defend herself from that which attempted to overwhelm her self-defense subroutines, to shield herself from this unknown that threatened her children, her crew, her creators. And I asked her, as a friend, to be at the coordinates her captain had given me, and she went with a sigh, like the last thoughts of a suicidal plunge from a skyscraper, and we were not.